All right, so I think we're ready to get started. Thank you for coming. This has been a project which has been in development for several years. And I'm talking, of course, about the dissertation defense of Basha Andraka-Christou. Basha is a 2013 graduate of the Maurer School of Law. She has been working very hard for the last 3 years on coursework and her dissertation, which she will tell you about today. The committee members are in the front row, and with the exception of Aaron.
I can move.
No, you're fine. You're fine. So what we're going to do is just have a 20-minute presentation with PowerPoint followed by a roughly 10-15-minute public question and answer session. At that time, we will close proceedings and we will proceed to do what dissertation committees do well, which is try to make the candidate feel uncomfortable, which is ask questions ourselves about the dissertation and give directions for potentially future development. And then at the conclusion, Basha will have completed the requirements for her degree. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Ms. Andraka-Christou.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. As Jody mentioned, I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to be focusing really on a handful of legal barriers to medication-assisted treatment here. Here is a roadmap of what I'm going to be looking at. So I'm going to focus really on 3 barriers, although I do believe there are more barriers. The ones I'm going to focus on are the legal barriers, the barriers experienced by physicians, so particularly insurance and lack of education in medical schools about addiction treatment, and then thirdly, cultural barriers and misunderstandings within the criminal justice system. So to provide a little bit of background about why this is an important issue, I'm sure most of you have heard of the overdose crisis that is currently facing the United States. So in the last 10 years, there's been a quadrupling of deaths from opioid overdoses. Opioids include prescription painkillers such as oxycodone, hydrocodone, but they also include illicit drugs such as heroin. And in the last 10 years in particular, we've seen an increase in heroin deaths. So deaths from heroin overdose have increased by a factor of 7 in the last 10 years, and they are continuing to increase as more and more individuals are switching from prescription pain pills to heroin. The regulations have been a little more strict in recent years on the prescription pain pills, and those individuals who are already dependent on prescription pain pills are finding it easier and less costly now to access heroin. But as you might imagine, heroin carries other risks beyond just, of course, overdose. It carries the risk, for example, of HIV spreading throughout the community and also hepatitis C spreading throughout the community. So this is, of course, of great concern to the nation right now. I'm going to briefly touch on the first type of treatment that is effective and available for opioid dependence, and that is psychosocial behavioral interventions, which can really be broken into 2 categories. So there's mental health counseling, typically provided, of course, by professional, usually a licensed professional, and then there's also peer support groups such as NA or AA. We do have some pretty solid evidence out there that mental health counseling is effective for individuals suffering from substance dependence and opioid dependence. It helps them go through their life avoiding triggers. It helps them manage other mental health disorders they may already be facing in addition to the addiction problems. Peer support groups can also be helpful, though we have less evidence because they're a little bit harder to study in part. As you can imagine, it's hard to randomize someone in a controlled double-blind fashion into a peer support group. What we do know is that for at least a minority of patients, it can be really helpful to have them have a new network of friends, a new community that is no longer the drug-seeking community they were with before, but individuals who are trying to abstain from drugs or alcohol, as it may be. Unfortunately, we also know that at least 25% of individuals who go to these groups who are on medication-assisted treatments feel stigmatized within these groups. They're told that they're not actually clean or sober, that they're substituting one drug with another drug if they're taking a medication to treat addiction. So there are still some problems that need to be worked through with these groups. But hopefully, as a society, we can either promote more groups that are oriented towards individuals taking medications for addiction or help to somehow modify the existing support groups. Now, the focus of my presentation is on medication-assisted treatment. And of course, methadone and buprenorphine are medications that do contain an opioid ingredient. Naltrexone does not contain, or extended-release naltrexone does not contain an opioid ingredient. However, it is a little bit more difficult for individuals to access than the other two. Fewer physicians are knowledgeable about extended-release naltrexone or Vivitrol. It also requires the individual to completely detox before initiating the medication. And for some individuals, that can be really difficult. We do have a lot of evidence that methadone and buprenorphine are extremely effective at decreasing mortality and morbidity. So one widely cited study, actually by the US government, it's been cited many times, is that they found a 50% decrease in death from overdose among individuals who are treated with methadone or buprenorphine. We have less studies on Vivitrol, but that's in part because it's a much more recent medication. There are concerns with diversion as well for methadone and buprenorphine because they do contain an opioid ingredient, and that is something that as a society we need to try to deal with, either by creating diversion-proof formulas such as depot injections or subdermal implants. But at the same time, we do have some research showing that when it is purchased illicitly on the street, it's oftentimes to prevent withdrawal symptoms or for the individual trying to self-treat due to lack of access through physicians' offices for the medication. So when we've had studies comparing buprenorphine and methadone in particular to behavioral methods only, buprenorphine and methadone are better at preventing morbidity and mortality if you just compare A to B. But the ideal scenario, of course, is that you have both. And so that is also a problem that I've seen in a lot of my interviews is that, there'll be a practitioner only providing one or a practitioner only providing another, but not associating between themselves. And so, again, that's another issue that as a society, as a government, we need to try to deal with is integrating these methods into clinics and treatment centers. So the focus of my presentation is the barriers, and these barriers are really problematic because they're leading to underuse of medication-assisted treatment. And as I just mentioned, it's an extremely effective treatment for opioid dependence. So we know that the underuse is really quite severe. At any given time, any individuals who have suffered from opioid dependence, only 40% of them have accessed either at that moment or previously medication-assisted treatment. So that's a really low number for a very effective treatment. Likewise, in addiction treatment centers, the majority of them do not offer or provide medication-assisted treatment, and many of them are abstinence-only centers, meaning they prohibit individuals from entering when they're on medication-assisted treatment, or they just refuse to provide medication-assisted treatment. And in private centers in particular, we see that there's really a focus, and 90% of them on NA and AA, oftentimes to the exclusion of the medication-assisted treatment rather than allowing both to flourish together. In prisons and in the criminal justice system, the problem is even more extreme. So in prisons, there is some level of methadone provision, still less than 50%, very little provision of buprenorphine, almost no provision of Vivitrol, in part because it's very costly and new. And then referrals, as you can see, are hardly ever made to individuals after they leave prison. And this is really problematic because the risk of death upon leaving prison is very, very high for individuals who suffer from opioid dependence. So that is the number one cause of death for individuals leaving prison is overdose from opioids. And then within drug courts, we know that from a national study of drug courts by Matuso, 50% outright ban the use of medication-assisted treatment throughout the nation. So before looking into what I learned from interviews from physicians and from judges and probation officers and counselors, I just want to briefly lay out the legal barriers that exist for these medications because they are interesting as they're unique to medication-assisted treatment. There is no other medication that I am aware of in the U.S. that has the same types of barriers as methadone or buprenorphine does from a legal standpoint. So for methadone in particular, for the purpose of providing addiction treatment treatment, it can only be provided in an opioid treatment program, also known as a methadone clinic. It cannot be provided in a physician's office. On the other hand, methadone being prescribed for pain management can be provided in a physician's office. Now, it's a different dosage, and it's actually a lower dosage for pain, but more frequent. However, the main difference that I see in a lot of physicians I've interviewed see is really who's the patient population. One is a really socially stigmatized patient population in addiction, and one is a much more sympathetic population, older individuals, people suffering from cancer, chronic illnesses, and these individuals are able to access the methadone through the physician's office. Methadone is a Schedule II narcotic, but it is treated differently from any other Schedule II narcotic in the nation. Likewise, buprenorphine has a very unique regulatory system. It's a Schedule III narcotic, also totally regulated differently from other Schedule III narcotics. It can be prescribed in a physician's office, but that physician has to have met a certification requirement, so either 8 hours of an online course or have completed a board-certified program in addiction medicine. And then there's a handful of other ways that really affect a very, very small minority of physicians. So overall, we know that in 46% of U.S. counties, there is not a single physician who is certified to prescribe buprenorphine. And of all physicians, only 2% are in the nation, so it's very low. Furthermore, there are patient limits for buprenorphine, and these patient limits don't exist for any other medication in the nation, which as an attorney, I find really fascinating. It makes me wonder what is so unique about this medication, and is it really the medication that is so unique, or is it really, again, the population that is getting the medication that's so unique, and is that somehow discriminatory? So we're currently, as I speak right now, we're going through some really big changes in terms of the patient limits. The current law is that in the first year of certification, the physician can treat up to 30 patients. In the second year, up to 100. The new change that happened a week ago is the Department of Health and Human Services said for a subgroup of physicians who are board certified or practice in very narrowly defined, qualified healthcare clinics, those physicians in their third year can treat up to 275 patients, but not all physicians. So this is now a very new rule. We don't really know how it's going to affect patients, how it's going to affect potential diversion, but this is something that I've personally been arguing for a long time, that we need to increase these patient limits. And then finally, I'll mention Probufen, which is actually a brand new medication that contains buprenorphine. It was approved in May by the FDA, and it is a subdermal implant. So it's implanted in the arm, and for 6 months, it provides the medication to individuals who are addicted to opioids. And this requirement is the same as the buprenorphine requirements from a regulatory perspective, with one additional requirement. So physicians also need to get a certification in the implantation procedure or work with the physician who is certified in the implantation procedure. And again, that's a very unique thing for Probufen relative to any other medications in the U.S. Naltrexone, extended release naltrexone, Vivitrol is the only medication in here that does not have some really unique kind of almost discriminatory regulatory structure, and that's good. But like I said, it's really the least used in the nation. Okay, so in order to assess how these barriers work in practice and also what other barriers physicians and clinics are facing, I interviewed 21 physicians, and I'm actually still continuing interviews. I have another one this week, and 8 mental health counselors. Most of the physicians I interviewed practice addiction medicine, but some of them do not, and all of the counselors do practice addiction therapy. So there are a number of themes that came out of these interviews just across the board. It was kind of fascinating because I interviewed physicians in Indiana, in Illinois, and also a handful now in Florida, and yet these themes are consistent everywhere. So firstly, there's the sense that addiction is unfortunately separated from mainstream medicine. So addiction treatment, you have to go to the methadone clinic or you have to have this special certification, and physicians don't really understand generally why this is the case. Why is addiction being so separated? Additionally, and part of the reason for the separation, physicians are really undereducated about addiction. So in general, when I have interviewed physicians, they tell me that in medical school they got 1 hour, maybe one day of a lecture about addiction treatment, and that was it. I had a handful that told me they never learned about addiction treatment at all in medical school. In residency, it's even less. Really, it's the psychiatry residents who learned a little bit about addiction treatment, but even there, it wasn't the focus. They were focusing on other mental health issues. So as a result, you can kind of understand then why we have this regulatory system in place of very specialized clinics only, because there's this assumption culturally that the average physician cannot treat this properly. But, and it's a chicken and egg situation. What do we fix first, the regulatory structure or increasing the education for physicians? And of course, I think both are needed. Another issue that I hear widely about is a lack of parity between coverage from insurance for addiction treatments, mental health treatments, and other types of treatments. And federal law does require in most cases that insurance parity is equal, that there is parity between all types of treatments, addiction and other physical illnesses. But what I'm finding is that in particular Medicaid coverage, there does not seem to be parity in a lot of states. So in Indiana, HIP 2.0 does cover methadone for pain management, but it does not cover methadone for addiction treatment, and that's problematic, and it's also the case in other states too. Another major problem that I hear over and over again, probably the most frequent problem I hear, is really obsessive prior authorization requirements for buprenorphine that are to the exclusion of any other medications that the physician prescribes. And these are really extreme in the sense that they happen every 6 months. And the most shocking thing to me and most disconcerting thing is oftentimes they require the physician to sign essentially a contract saying, we promise to wean the patient off of this medication in 6 months or in 1 year. And that's completely contrary to the medical standard of care, which says that individuals should be on these medications as long as they need to be. And in some cases, since it's a chronic relapsing disease, it might be their entire lives. And for some individuals, that's okay. So having the insurance company tell the physician, you have to promise us this, is obviously very problematic. And I've heard kind of interestingly from some physicians that they have a way of reaching out to the insurance companies and telling them this is a bad idea. So they have letters they've pre-typed out saying, this is contrary to the medical standard of care. See these journal articles, and they'll email that or scan it and send it to the insurance company. Another major parity problem I hear about is reimbursement being too low for behavioral health care in general. And really that works out in two ways. So one is in terms of medical treatments, for addiction, you don't really have any high-tech, expensive things involved, right? You have counseling by the physician about the medications being used, and you have the prescribing of the medications. You're not using an MRI machine or doing surgery. So it's already a lower reimbursement level for this type of medicine practice. But then in addition to that, you have this other level of it's a longer session, a longer appointment with the patient. So it's not usually 10 minutes with the patient, it's an hour sometimes. So when you factor those two things together, on per hour, let's say, the physician is getting paid much less for treating addiction than, say, per hour of treating something like diabetes or another comparable chronic relapsing condition. And so that appears to be a parity violation in the minds of a lot of physicians. I do hear concerns about some bad clinics, and physicians worry that this is making, medication-assisted treatment look bad for society. So there are methadone clinics that provide too low of dosages. And those individuals then who go to those methadone clinics will only have their cravings met by the medication for part of the day, and then the rest of the day they'll have to go seek, a heroin or something else to satisfy their cravings. Likewise, just the separation of methadone clinics into a specific area where all the addicted individuals go causes major stigmatization to those individuals, and also causes an increase in crime as drug dealers know exactly whom to target and where to go and to kind of intercept them on their way to their treatment. And finally, there's also concerns with physicians or clinics who are providing too much buprenorphine without providing sufficient counseling. And most disconcertingly, and physicians just are in a rage about this a lot, there are many, including in Bloomington, that refuse to accept any type of insurance, Medicaid, commercial health insurance. And what that causes is these patients who are usually low income to sell part of their medication on the street in order to get cash to then pay for their next visit at the physician's office. So it's actually incentivizing criminal behavior. And finally, I'll mention that there does seem to be a barrier of criminal justice policies where drug courts or probation officers, parole officers will tell the patient in the criminal justice system, you cannot do methadone, you cannot do buprenorphine, you can only do Vivitrol, and the physician wants a different medication to be prescribed for the patient because they feel like a different medication would be better. So some physicians feel that there is this barrier coming from the criminal justice system in terms of their own autonomy and treating patients effectively. So finally, I'll mention that I also interviewed representatives of 20 drug and veterans courts in Indiana. And in brief, I would say the two main outcomes of this are there are hardly any physicians involved in decision-making in drug courts. Of 20 courts that I interviewed, the treatment teams who make decisions about participants in the court, only 2 of 20 actually had a physician on board. So therefore, not surprisingly, the majority of the courts either completely banned methadone or buprenorphine or allowed it, but said you have to wean the patient, the participant, off in 3 weeks or 3 months or 6 months, again, completely contrary to the medical standard of care. And sometimes, in my opinion, almost looks like a judge practicing medicine without a license, saying, I know this physician wants you to do X, but I'm telling you, you need to do Y instead. And finally, the one place that I saw some hope was in the veterans courts. The veterans courts appear to be very connected to the Veterans Health Services Administration, and they seem to have more interaction with physicians there and more trust of physicians there, and they were the ones who tended to be a little bit more open to medication-assisted treatment and to just allowing the physician to be in the driver's seat as opposed to the judge or other members on the treatment team who are typically probation officers, law enforcement, and attorneys, and some counselors. Finally, the First Amendment technically bans or prohibits drug court judges from saying you have to go to NA or AA because there is a spiritual component. But what I found is 19 of the 20 courts require a support group. And when I ask, are there alternative support groups other than AA or AA, they usually say no. There's either they're really hard to access or they just don't exist in our community. So when you combine those two factors, the mandate to go to a support group and there's not really another type of support group, that to me sounds like a potential First Amendment violation. So I understand that I have reached time now, or can I keep going? Okay, so this is my final slide. So these are some potential solutions to managing these barriers as a society. So first of all, I think that there is this profound lack of knowledge about addiction treatment, and it in large part stems from lack of knowledge about addiction. And I think that lack of knowledge stems from a stigma of addiction, this misunderstanding that it's a moral issue, a willpower issue, not a medical issue. If more people understood it as a medical issue, perhaps they'd be more willing to have physicians involved kind of in the driver's seat, if you will, in making these kind of decisions rather than, say, a judge or someone in the criminal justice system. I also find it highly problematic that addiction treatment is not integrated into mainstream medicine. I think we need to stop separating methadone clinics, stop treating buprenorphine very differently from other medications, and also the education of physicians has to increase. And hopefully, as the education of physicians increases about addiction treatment, there will be less of a concern about separating these medications into unique clinics where only some physicians are knowledgeable. As I mentioned before, diversion-proof formulas could help deal with some of the diversion concerns that I hear from physicians and I hear also from the criminal justice system. As far as parity enforcement, it really seems to me like the parity law enforcement is lacking right now. And that really is in the hands of both the federal government, and in some states there is an enforcer who's supposed to be enforcing that. And it just seems to me from physicians who I've heard that this isn't really happening. I've always asked physicians in my interviews, do you feel like there's parity? And not a single physician of the 21 physicians told me I feel like there's actual parity right now between addiction treatment and other treatment. And then finally, I think that there is a strong potential role for the state government in incentivizing clinics that are getting state grants for funding, such as to community clinics, federally qualified health clinics, and also to prisons and criminal justice systems. They can incentivize them to allow more physicians to be involved in decision-making, to open up policies allowing medication-assisted treatment, either by saying we'll give you extra money if you do this, or by saying we won't give you any money at all if you don't allow physician decision-making and medication-assisted treatment. And that is the end of my presentation.
At this point, we'll open it up to public questions. Yes.
Tasha, I'd be curious, since so much of this has to do with the physicians who are actually involved in this kind of treatment, do you sense in your interactions with them any willingness to try to help change this? And I guess I'm curious on two levels. One is the physicians themselves, in terms of, do they see themselves in a role of empowerment to be able to go to the state legislature or go to their colleagues? But I'm also curious, and I don't have any reason to believe you would have looked at this, but what do the medical societies think about this, and how do they approach these issues as well?
Well, actually, the two questions are kind of tied. So the main organization that oversees addiction medicine is the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and they are really, really active in pushing for legislative reforms. And in fact, they were probably the key player in pushing for this recent lifting of patient limits for a certain group of physicians for buprenorphine. So I do think that they're being really active in this. I think the problem in large part stems from the lack of education for physicians who aren't under that umbrella of addiction medicine, so primary care physicians, pain management physicians, anesthesiologists. I think that when they're not associated with this kind of group and they maybe have some addiction patients, but they're just, referring them off, they don't have that same level of investment in this idea. And at the same time, the separation of methadone clinics and buprenorphine certification, I think, kind of reinforces this in that they don't really get to see methadone patients, for example. They don't really interact with the methadone physicians because they are so separated from other physicians in society.
Yes. Is this, I'm a physician, I work at a methadone clinic sometimes, and I am curious, is it illegal the way it is covered by insurance for pain and not covered for insurance? They're paying cash, and even the voucher program that Recovery Works in some settings cannot cover it for them. So there's isn't that illegal?
It's a great question, and actually many physicians have asked me, is it actually legal that we, can have insurance cover it for pain management but not for addiction? And in my opinion, I think it's illegal. I think it's a violation of mental health parity law. So the Affordable Care Act extended equity rules into, it used to be just policies that covered groups of patients, but now under the Affordable Care Act, parity laws also apply to individual insurance purchased on the marketplace and also to Medicaid groups, group coverage, so like Medicaid Advantage, and also to Medicaid that has been expanded. So really the only type of insurance that isn't affected by this rule is fee-for-service Medicaid in states that didn't expand Medicaid. So that's a really small percentage of policy holders in the nation who don't have the parity law applying to them. So yeah, I do think for most cases it's a parity law violation.
And in response to your question about the physicians, I know my fellowship supervisors have gone many times to advocate for some of these changes at the state, and it doesn't seem to change. Some things change, but they have gone and advocated and presented bills.
Yeah, well, our legislators are not necessarily that interested in this issue too, which is problematic as well, and kind of a whole nother slide potentially.
Any sense of the genesis of these unique restrictions on these medications? Because it's such an outlier.
Oh yeah.
So who was driving the bus? Who was?
Well, so I would say history is driving the bus. It's kind of a path-dependent outcome. In the early 19th century, it used to be that the average physician was providing maintenance treatment in the form of providing morphine to patients who they suspected were addicted. And of course, this wasn't FDA approved, but it was just they would do this. And then when the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed, Anti-Narcotics Tax Act was passed in 1915. At that point, the Supreme Court interpreted the act as saying physicians cannot provide opioids outside of the regular practice of medicine. And in 1915, maintenance treatment was not understood as a regular practice of medicine. The Supreme Court interpreted that as being criminal behavior. So starting really around 1917, after this act was interpreted, physicians started to leave addiction treatment in terms of providing maintenance treatment. And also between 1917 and 1920, there were the largest DEA raids on physicians' offices in history. And that kind of further incentivized physicians to leave the practice of maintenance treatment provision. So at that point, who do you really have step in? You have the counselors and then support groups, and in the 1930s you have AA and NA form. And so until the 1970s, when methadone is developed, those groups are the ones who are responsible for addiction treatment. And then once methadone is approved, and it has 3 different levels of regulation, so you have FDA, DEA, and at one point it was Treasury regulations also. It was just so complex, the regulatory structure, that it further kind of pushed physicians, I think, out of treatment for addiction, except for the handful who were treating patients with methadone in these specialized clinics. So when you move forward to 2002, when buprenorphine is approved in the US for addiction, you kind of have this history of physicians being separated and treatment really being in the hands of just counselors or just support groups. And really until this year, I think, is the first time I've seen legislatures being concerned about this and thinking, hey, maybe we really should include physicians more.
That's a great answer. I mean, it's been going on for 100 years, essentially, and we haven't progressed.
Yeah.
But alcoholism doesn't seem to fall in that, doesn't have the same stigma, doesn't have the same restrictions.
No, of course, alcohol was prohibited for some time, and I do think that the alcohol movement does kind of influence drug policy in the following sense that when alcohol was prohibited in the U.S., there was this sense, this idea among legislatures that now that it's illegal, no one will be addicted to it anymore. So they actually started cutting funding, both federally and statewide, to clinics for treating alcoholism. And in kind of move forward in the future, once there's the drug war and we're really concerned about heroin, cocaine, et cetera, there's also this kind of similar idea borrowed from alcohol prohibition. If we just make these medications not only illegal, but like really strongly enforced with mandatory minimums, then there's not really going to be a reason to focus on treatment, because anyone who was addicted will probably just die off or just stop using it because, well, it's illegal, so why use it? So I do think there's some misconstrued notions being borrowed from alcohol prohibition.
Also, the treatment for alcohol isn't something that can be diverted. The ways that you treat alcohol use disorder, aren't things that can be diverted. So
right.
That does kind of change.
Yeah, that's true. So the medications are not scheduled narcotics.
Any other questions? All right, well, at this point, I'd like to close proceedings.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.